Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars. Topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Basketball Podcast, right here on the GSMC Podcast Network. You know what we do here. I'm your host, Bryce. Obviously, the jam-packed show for you today. Obviously, we're going to talk about, obviously, something that's been happening in the nation for the last few years. Floyd, death, disgusting death, when he was killed by a police officer. We're going to talk about how the NBA has responded, how the players have responded to that, how they've gone out into the community and helped the communities as much as they can during this time of a lot of unrest within our country. But obviously, we're not only going to talk about that, so don't worry. Don't feel like, oh, here we go for 60 minutes. No, calm down. We're going to also talk about other NBA news that have also came up, because the NBA has been still progressing forward towards the season. We're going to talk about some of the formats and layouts that they're also now agreeing on to, saying they are interested in doing. So we're going to discuss my thoughts on that. Certain players on life max deals. And we're also going to have some more discussion points during this podcast. And we're going to discuss different things. So obviously, you know what we do here. We're going to talk about everything like that, because that's what we do. Okay? All right, cool. So basically, look. Obviously, we know the state of our country right now. We are aware of the state of our country. We are aware of what's going on right now. We see the things that have been happening behind the scenes, and it is considered disgusting. It is considered shameful, and just puts a bad name on the nation. But one light that we can also point to in the protests is how the NBA players especially, have handled this crisis. Jaylen Brown, I believe he went to high school down here. Jaylen Brown drove 15 hours to come to protest in Atlanta. So clearly, since that happened, you can see that's one guy who is very dedicated to the cause, very dedicated to what's going on, very dedicated to everything. Willing to take time out of his schedule, take time out of his day to make that trip. And that's a great thing for him. It's a great thing because he wasn't the only Boston Celtics player who went out of their way. Ernest Cantor was out there on the front lines on the protests. And we all have if you're aware of what's happening with Ernest Cantor, we know about the issues of his own government that he has back in Turkey, in the Turkish government. And then also seeing him now even dealing with what happens in the United States and their government and their police force, whatever, is just another great sign of just the players. I feel like the NBA, through all situations, has always handled themselves brilliantly. They've always handled themselves with grace, and they've always made a difference, or at least attempted to make a difference if they can. Adam Silver has told people within the league, we need to go out here and make as much of a difference as we can. Adam Silver in the league has very much followed what the players wanted to do. That's why people consider the NBA a players' league, because they usually go with what the players say and want. And obviously some people are going to be like, oh, players shouldn't have that type of power. But in these situations, this would probably be the best time for the players to have the power, with everything that's going on right now. So that this is one of the reasons why this has been happening and why this has been so great for everybody involved. You know, you had LeBron speak out. Obviously, LeBron has been very vocal for years about his political views, about what's been happening in the world, giving opinions, even though a lot of people have gotten onto him about it. But people forget, especially back in the 60s and 70s, some of the top athletes in the world were very, very much on the political front lines. And it's crazy how now when LeBron goes out on the political front lines, we're very critical. We say stick to basketball. We basically hate when they do that. It's something that I've noticed within the sports network, sports, any type of podcast, any type of anything with sports. Obviously, yes, people use sports as an escape from the real world, but sometimes what's happening in the real world is so big, you can't escape even within sports. And so you have to still address it. And obviously a lot of fans don't like that because they really do watch and listen to podcasts and shows and channels to get away from it, and then they're still talking about it, and they're just like, I don't want to see this. This isn't CNN. This isn't MSNBC. This isn't Fox. I don't want to see this. I'm sure there's people who could be listening to this podcast coming here thinking, I'm here to hear about basketball, even though this is a basketball related topic because that's what the NBA's been doing, but they don't want to hear about this basketball related news, and they might turn this podcast off and stop listening to me just because of that. Maybe they'll just fast forward through it. I mean, really, you know, you can tell from a get-go, everyone's feeling a type of way. Everyone's feeling some type of feeling about what's going on out there. And it's something that will continue to be the case for a while. So there's so much that could be taken from this, you know. Trae Young was talking to protesters in Atlanta, you know, sending a great message. It's very, I mean, you have seen, if you follow NBA Twitter, you have seen the amount of tweets, the amount of things said by so many NBA players. Isaiah Thomas has been one of the main vocal activists. Lou Williams has been one of the main local activists. Those two I've seen a lot on my timeline. You've seen Donovan Mitchell tweet. You've seen so many because of how it impacts people in this country. You know, it's been just a great pouring out of support from the NBA. And even with COVID, we applauded NBA for handling this situation. With this as well, I also applaud the NBA for how they're handling this situation. They have done a great job. I can't sit here and be mad. I can't sit here and complain. I can't sit here and have an issue. Because they're doing what they feel like is best. And like I said, you cannot fault the players. I mean, listen, Greg Popovich has been one of the main activists as a coach in this league about the system, what's going on in the country. He came out and made a statement saying things need to change, saying what's been happening is disgusting. We know Greg now. He'll go out there and talk. He'll say some very controversial things if he has to get his point across. He is not scared of media backlash or anything. That's why Greg Popovich is one of the most respected coaches to ever coach in the NBA. Because it's easy for a guy like Lloyd Pierce to come out, or Nick McMillan to come out and say something about what's going on. But guys like Greg Popovich, is very important for them to also come out and say what's going on, to talk about what's going on out here. So it's literally crazy, but also encouraging to hear all the different many athletes and coaches in the NBA speak out about what's going on and addressing it the way they have been addressing it, because it's absolutely beautiful to see. And congratulations to the NBA for just being great at what they do in this situation. But coming up next, the NBA is talking about doing training camps and regional like a regional league for non-playoff teams, but also they're trying to include up to 22 teams in the next format in terms of who is and who isn't going to make the playoffs. All that right here and more on the podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed the outpouring of love and appreciation and support and just effort by the NBA players, NBA coaches in terms of what's going on in the country right now with all the protests. How the NBA has again proven themselves again as one of the top social activist leagues in the league, trying to do anything from their players, even to the office, trying to make a difference, trying to, make things happen. And it's absolutely wonderful to see. Absolutely wonderful to see. My hat goes off to them. And that's why, I'm a proud basketball and NBA fan because of these actions, because of these activities. But now we're going to get back into some basketball news, which I'm sure, like I said, a lot of you might have been waiting for. So right now, I'm going to talk about how the league wants to bring in 22 teams. But we're going to talk about that next segment. We're going to talk about what they want to do with the 8 non-playoff teams. So, the non-playoff squads are apparently pushing for at least a mandatory summer training camp or regional fall leagues. Because, obviously, the big thing is right now is, remember, they haven't played a game since March. They're currently not, looks like they're going to try to start the season in December. That's almost basically 9 months. You don't want players not playing basketball at the highest level for 9 months, while you might have the teams that are in the playoffs only potentially having 2 to 3 months of rest, but they've been able to play. So it's not as much of a break and as much as a lull. So obviously that's something that non-playoff teams have been trying to push for right now. They're trying to push for, hey, can we have some type of games or some type of camp to help get them some practice and playing time? And, one thing that a high-level Eastern Conference official said in the article by Bleacher Report is that the message was bigger, reminding people that some teams can't just reopen doors in 9 or 10 months and easily sell tickets or a sponsorship without having played basketball for that long. So obviously this shows you that this has a deeper, impact on teams, because it's one thing knowing, okay, yeah, we're going to have it by this time where, man, we're not playing for 9 months. We don't know if we want to keep this sponsored. Without anything happening, we don't know if we want divergence tickets, if we have even seen basketball for that long. It's definitely something that we have to see. Obviously, some of the owners and some of the people who have been on calls with the league have said that all 30 teams should return in some capacity. to the league, have some games, so that way, again, they can play, they can still go through the same processes and just be able to play. Obviously, small market teams are teams that could benefit from this because they make money from these games. And even though they may not be playing in front of a crowd, obviously the TV revenue money they could still get from this. And also potentially with sponsors. Atlanta Hawks owner says he wants to resume the season, even though he knows the Hawks are making the playoffs at 20-47. Golden State said he would be okay with playing games again, even though he knows the season's basically over for them. So it really just depends on the team. I feel like most teams, though, are okay with playing games because they also look at, well, we kind of need these games regardless of how it's actually going to end up for us. And also, one big thing we also got to look at, too, is this. You don't want players who haven't played in 8-9 months trying to come back and play because, again, injuries are a big part of the game. You don't want to take that chance with not played guys for a long time and then asking them, hey, we want you to come back and we want you to play for us. And then there you go. Obviously, that's not really the thing. So that's going to be very interesting to me. And we'll have to see, again, like I said, what the NBA actually decides to come up with. But the NBA has discussed 4 different scenarios in terms of the number of all the teams came back, 22 teams came back, 20 teams came back, or 16 teams. Even though, like I said, next segment we're going to get really into the format they actually did pick, but I'm going to talk to you about the 4 scenarios that they discussed with the number of teams. So first, if they brought back 16 teams, they would go directly to playoffs because they have their 16. The need for the regular season would not be there. There would be no point to play those games. You're just going to go with the 16 teams you got. Boom, playoffs, there you go, which is obviously, I think, the least favorable because, again, of the teams that have or were so close in the playoff race. Just not giving them the chance to make the playoffs, I think, is one reason why they really looked at this. And I think that's probably the big thing there. And that's why people really weren't going out of their way for it like that. Even though they said, obviously, they didn't have enough time in the season, that may be what they would have to do. But it looks like, as I said, they're not going to go in that direction. If they went to 20 teams, they would then do the group or stage play. So obviously, this is that group. You put them into 4 groups of 5 teams. And then and that would replace the end of the regular season and the first round of the playoffs. And then you would take those 10 teams, I guess, potentially, unless you do 4 teams of 6 would make more sense. 4 teams of 6, potentially. And then they would then have that happen, go into the semifinals, conference finals, NBA finals. I'm assuming if it was still by conference. Even if they did it by seeding, it'd be fine. It's just regular, just seeding. That would be also fine as well. Then 22 games. If they brought back 22 teams, they would have games to determine seeding and play-in tournaments for final seeds. So obviously, this would give the play teams a chance to play, while also still fighting for playoff rights and playoff positioning, but also give the teams that were close to making the playoffs a chance to still compete for the playoff spot and get into the playoffs as well if they can beat who they need to beat to play in to get into the to get into the season, to the playoffs, to the big dance. So obviously that would be the plan if they went with the 22 team plan. And then the 30 team plan would be a 72 game regular season, which I believe would be about 3 games, I think for most teams 4 games, and then have a play-in tourney. So obviously that would be pretty much the end of that in terms of the regular season in that regard. So obviously those were the 4 restart scenarios that they discussed. Like I said, the NBA has touched on so many different parts of how they would want this to go. And it just shows you their due diligence in their collective planning to go into this much detail about what they want to do moving forward. And that's something that you just love about what they've done so far when it came to the season and what they're trying to put in place so they could have the NBA season come back and still just be as exciting as it was before. But coming up next, we're going to talk about the NBA going with the 22 teams format when they vote on Thursday. We're also going to talk about some other NBA news around the league. All that here and more on the podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed the NBA and we break down 4 scenarios that they have been discussing in terms of what they may try to do for the return of the NBA. And we discussed that situation and how they're going about from 16 to 20 to 22 to 30 teams, what their plan would be for each number of teams if they brought them all back at once. But we also talked about if they didn't bring playoff teams back, what the non-playoff teams want from the league, which is at least a training camp or a regional league in the fall so they can at least be able to play basketball before the next season starts, so it's not like teams are having a 9-month layoff. So obviously, the NBA, again, addressing and trying to figure out a lot of different things to help ease the NBA season back into place and work out for everybody where everybody's happy what's going on. So right now, the NBA is supposed to have a vote on Thursday about the plan to move forward. So like I said, as the expectation looks right now is that the NBA season will return. And right now, the plan is to do a 22-team regular season format. Teams will, and this is from Kevin O'Connor of The Ringer, in a tweet, if the NBA resumes play with a 22-team regular season format, teams will likely play 8 games each, then a play-in tournament would take place for the 8th seed in each conference. Plans aren't finalized, but as of now, it appears conferences would stay in place. Obviously, the 8 games represent close to half of the remaining contests on each team's schedule and provide several tune-up opportunities for them to get used to live action again. While those games primarily affect borderline playoff teams, it does give a team like Los Angeles, the Clippers, Milwaukee, teams like that, a chance to build up some momentum prior to the playoffs starting. Obviously, the biggest thing from this is that everybody's going to be very excited for the play-in tournament, as this is something the NBA has been pushing around as an idea for a while, for future seasons. And now with Corona, having to now execute that plan and that idea now during this to see, okay, well, if this works out, if this makes sense, this is definitely something that we may have to keep around going into next seasons when we do get crowds again, etc. And it should also help with the regular season to help the league out, as it can recoup some of the revenue that was lost during the hiatus. And honestly, this plan seems like the best plan for both sides right now. And I think when we get that initial plan and that initial thing on Thursday, that's obviously going to be very exciting to hear what the NBA decides to do and what their final plans decide to be. As I'm sure, like I said before, a lot of people are excited. A lot of people are very hyped to see the NBA make a move like this that puts them in position. Because listen, they're expected to overwhelmingly pass it too. So it sounds like that's the one that everybody is supporting, that everybody likes. And listen, this will take place in Walt Disney World. Yeah, they're going to really take the rest of this week to finalize the structure and the format, but that this is the plan that they're going to go with, and this is the plan that they feel like will be best for them to bring them success for a season coming back after everything that has happened. So obviously that's something that's going to be very, very big for the NBA. And I'm sure a lot of people will be excited when Thursday hits, when they hear that news that the NBA is returning and then what the plan is, all the details of the plan, and etc. So obviously this would be a very interesting situation to see how everything actually ends up turning out when it gets down to it, as I said before. But in other news, we got two players who could be returning to their current teams and on max deals. So, the Washington Wizards. Obviously, Bradley Beal has been in flux. People wonder if he will be traded. He will probably be in trade talks for a while because of the situation that the Wizards are in. But the Wizards do believe that Bradley Beal will resign with them. He will be a part of the Wizards long term, and they expect him to sign another max deal with them moving forward, which obviously a lot of people I'm sure would be scratching their heads about. Why would Bradley Beal stay on a team that has not been competitive for a minute? But maybe Bradley Beal is just one of those loyalist players who feels like I'd rather play and try to bring a city a championship than chase a ring. And obviously, that's obviously a good sign if the team has confidence that they can bring him back and play. And they can bring him back and be able to get him back with whoever they decide to end up drafting. Listen, people think John Wall's coming to an end there, which we'll talk about more his future in the future segments. But, you know, it could be Bradley Beal, and we don't know who else will be his partner. We don't know who's going to be the other guy who's going to create the extra, basically the next backcourt of the Washington Wizards. And then another team, another player that could be in line to big money and staying with the team that he's with. Jason Tatum, they say, could get a max deal from the Boston Celtics, which I highly expect him to get. I highly expect Jason Tatum to get that max deal, especially based off how he's played, how he's improved, especially if he comes back from this hiatus and shows up in the playoffs and plays big. I expect him to definitely get a max contract. Now, obviously, this is going to put Boston in a tight situation with Jaylen Brown because you can't pay everybody. So someone's going to have to walk. To me, it looks like Jaylen Brown might be that player to walk, but we don't know. Maybe they're willing to go into a luxury tax for him. But Jason Tatum, I think for sure, will be getting that max deal and will be able to get that great money that he deserves. And usually he's just following suit with what a lot of players at his age does. You play your first 3-4 years out with your team. If you end up being one of the best, if not the best player on the team after that year, you get your max deal, which will then have you eligible for the supermax deal when your next deal ends. And if you continue to stay on this path and stay as great as you've been and then make an all-NBA team, now you're eligible for the supermax deal. And then Boston in about 4 to 5 years could be paying you over $50 million, potentially. So, obviously, all of that's going to be big for Jason Tatum because that could be a lot of money coming his way in the future if he continues to ball out like he has, which I'm sure he would love. But that's all we have here for this segment. Coming up next, there was a report saying that the NBA will be willing to do anything to try to get Zion Williamson into the playoffs. I'll talk about that report up next. And we'll also talk about what is John Wall's future with the Washington Wizards. All that here and more on the podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we discussed the 22 playoff format that the league looks like they will overwhelmingly vote for, as that is the plan and the format they will use to bring the season back, which will include, based off what the Ringers reporter said, which is 8 regular season games and then a play-in tourney for the 8 spots in both conferences, as it looks like they're going to keep the conferences in terms of playoffs. We also talked about Bradley Beal, as the Wiz are feeling very confident that he'll end up actually going ahead and still re-signing with them. So obviously that's a big deal if Bradley Beal does actually still end up and staying in Washington after everything that's happened. And then we also discussed Jason Tatum, as he's also in line to get a max deal from the Boston Celtics. Obviously, I think based off how he's played and everything that's happened, he definitely deserves that. He deserves getting that, as he has emerged himself into one of the young superstars in today's game. So obviously that was the news we talked about last segment as well. Now we're going into this news, continuing on what we've been doing, continuing on with what we've been reporting on. And we're going to talk about a report that came out a couple of days ago, that the NBA, during the planning of how they want to bring the season back, was willing to do anything or have any type of scenario to give Zion Williamson a chance to get back into the playoffs. Which is interesting because obviously people would sit there and think, wait, so a current team that's not in the playoffs, even though they were fighting for a playoff spot, you're saying you're willing to dictate plans to do what you can to increase his chances of making the playoffs. I think that's very interesting when you think about it on paper. That the NBA is actually sitting here saying, we really need to, we need to try to get Zion in the tournament, in the big dance of the NBA playoffs. Now, if you look at maybe why that would be the case, now listen. I guess people would say, especially after what's happened for the last year and a half, 2 years while he was at Duke and while he was with the Pelicans, Zion is one of the few players like LeBron James who can move the needle for you from a ratings perspective in the NBA. Because listen, you have the normal big crowd that watches games, especially good games. But you have certain players where it doesn't matter if they're going against a bad team or a good team, just them playing gets ratings. And I think the NBA views Zion as one of those players, which obviously, if they bring the playoffs back and the season back, obviously putting Zion on national television, you would think would increase ratings, and that would obviously get more views on them, even though the Pelicans aren't necessarily the greatest team in the world. Even though they're a very fun and interesting team to watch. So to think that the NBA would maybe do something as that to forwardly project that they would want a guy like Zion in there for that kind of reasoning is very interesting. Because like I said, Zion is one of those very, very few players who is looked at that can really move the needle. And so, obviously, if he can move the needle, that clearly puts them in position about money. And then putting the Pelicans, because you really don't hear the Pelicans a lot, even though they had a lot of primetime games this year. You don't really look at the Pelicans as a team that people are going to go out of their way to watch. But that's probably, again, why with Zion on the team, they're like, okay, we want him here. We want him on TV. We want him in front of the crowd. We want him in front of everybody because we want him increasing our ratings for our games. Because I said the NBA's perfect scenario in the first round would be a LeBron versus Zion matchup. Because they feel like, even though you know the Lakers would win 4 or 5 games, just the fact that Zion and LeBron are playing, two of your biggest needle movers, that's going to be big. And that's going to be very interesting, which I guess that's why they sometimes say that's why they're going to 22 teams, because that's just enough teams to get him in to the playoff contention, at least giving him the opportunity to make the playoffs, at least in that regard, because the opportunity would then be there for them to then get in. So obviously I just found that very interesting if that actually ends up being anywhere close to the case of why they really want Zion in the playoffs at the end of the day. So we're going to have to see what happens with that. But I'm also going to talk about another player for the Washington Wizards that we talked about. Obviously, we talked about Bradley Beal last time. We're going to talk about John Wall. Obviously, John Wall is in a situation right now where he recently came out and said he's 110% healthy for the next season. He's ready to go. So it probably looks like even if the Wizards have a chance to make the playoffs, it doesn't sound like John Wall will be participating, even though he could play maybe, just to make sure he's ready, because maybe it's still too soon at this moment. But he's already declared himself ready to go for next year. So one question we have to ask is, what's the situation with John Wall's future? What is John Wall's future with the Wizards and in the league in general? Because it does feel as if it seems very unlikely that the Wizards will keep John Wall around. I believe his deal is up and about after this not after this season, but after the next coming season, I think. I'm not 100% sure. But obviously, he may not be in the Wizards' plans anymore. And obviously, he's coming off an injury. He's about to enter 30. And obviously, we don't know what kind of player we're going to be getting when John Wall comes back. So, because remember, John Wall has played for 12 years now, I believe. He came out at 19. So, yeah, he's about 30, 31 when the next season comes around. And it'll be interesting to see where he ends up. Because you don't really know. I think he'll play next season with Washington. I do. Because remember, his contract is very untradeable to a lot of people. But I definitely think when free agency hits for him, I think he will definitely end up leaving. But I don't think at the same time, obviously we have to see how he does during the next season. I don't think maybe he would go and maybe get another max deal potentially. But I do think obviously a team would take a flyer on bringing him in. I definitely think that would happen. So that's going to be very interesting moving forward to see what John Wall's future and potential could be moving into the future. But coming up next, we're going to talk about, is the NBA the shining example of how a league should be and how it should be ran? Find that out, all that and more right here on the podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed John Wall's future with the Washington Wizards. I think that he'll play out his last year of his deal with the Wizards, but I do think he'll end up leaving. It'll be interesting to see which teams could potentially want to go after him. And so, John Wall's future may be limited or very numbered when it comes to the Wizards, but I don't think his career and his playing career is out of reach in terms of him still maybe making impact on an NBA team in the future. If John Wall can stay healthy, I definitely see him still being a productive player in the league. We also talked about a report that the NBA, when conducting how they wanted to create this format, wanted to try to give Zion an opportunity to still make the playoffs. So in a way, trying to find a way to get him into the playoffs so he's not on the outside looking in because of how big of a ratings mover he is for them, like he was earlier in the season when he returned and also in college. And we discussed that, my thoughts on that report. But now we're going to discuss just the NBA in general. We're going to discuss, has the NBA been the shining example of what of a league should be? As I talked about in the first segment of the show, the NBA has done an absolutely wonderful job with how they've controlled, how they've went about COVID, and how they've went about the planning of how to bring the season back, every precaution they're trying to take, but also what they're doing right now with the protests, not just from the office and Adam Silver, but to the players as well. And so it brings up the question of, should the NBA be the shining example of what all the leagues need to be? Or what they should strive to be in terms of handling these types of situations? The NBA, one thing you can say about them is they're very good at adjusting on the fly. They're good at adjusting to situations when needed. They're a very flexible league, I would say. You know, remember, they had to change their entire calendar up because of this. If they were able to do it, they were able to come with a plan. And they still have things, obviously, they're still figuring out along the way, which is obviously that's a part of the process. But it seems like they're coming to things, they're discussing every option that could potentially be out there. Because not only are they thinking about, okay, how can we bring the season back? How can we go into the offseason? How we can get into next season? They're also discussing how do we want to get there? How can we still make it just as entertaining as it's always been? How can we make it just as good as it's always been? They've talked to and discussed all of that. And then obviously if we're talking about, like I said, outside of the court, just the activeness, the commitment, everything. Don't forget all the things they did during COVID with all the horse tournament, 2K tournament, everything. How they were constantly doing things to donate for charity and etc. You know, if you look at the other leagues, and obviously I'm not, if based off what I say, I am not here to take shots at anybody. I'm not here to do any of that. But if you think about, let's say baseball. Obviously baseball is still trying to figure out what they want to do. Obviously they're trying to figure out money, procreating, salaries, everything like that. We also have a GSMC baseball podcast if you want to listen to that. If you want to learn more deep inside depth on baseball, if you're a fan of that, you should go to check that out. Just a cheap plug. But, you know, they're trying to figure out how they want to bring the season back. How are they going to do the games? Everything. Obviously, all of that is a very big thing for them. And in baseball, MLB has never been looked at as a league that's great at adjusting. That's great at moving and changing on the fly. Which is why maybe they've struggled to adapt. If you look at the NFL, if you listen to the podcast that me and Ethan did that we recorded earlier, we discussed that. We discussed that the league hasn't done the greatest job when it came to, you know, conducting what they want to do when it comes to everything that's been happening. Obviously, the NFL season ended when COVID hit, so literally it was just more about the offseason programming they had to worry about. But in terms of drafts and everything and free agency, they could still go through with that. But when it comes to camps, they couldn't do that. And they're still planning on still maybe having a mini camp this month, training camp in July, regular preseason in August, regular season is planned in September. But if you talk about off the field, obviously people bringing up a lot with all the protests and everything, what's happened with Colin Kaepernick. How when the NFL was in this position with this type of thing within their league, a lot of people feel like they alienated a man who just wanted to create awareness of change. Where now, something like this happens, the NFL tries to come out and say we are behind the movement, and now you have its own players saying, remember what just happened 2-3 years ago? Are you sure you're behind this movement? You know, NHL, if you heard the news with them, they decided to say, hey, we're cutting out the regular season. We're going straight to playoffs when we come back. And like I said, it's just every league has their questions. And every league has things that a lot of fans of that respective sport are very unsure about or very split on. I mean, listen. There are still people who think the NBA season shouldn't be coming back. There are people who sit here and think, well, why are we doing this? Just an asterisk by it. Why would we break it back? Why not just end it? I mean, Everybody has an argument. Everybody has a valid point. It just really depends on the person. So it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting moving forward. And the NBA has just, I feel like, set a standard, set a level that leagues should at least, I'm not saying be a carbon copy, but you should at least look into adapting some of the things that the NBA has done into your league to help with any type of critical situation that could pop up like this again in the future. Because these situations may arise again. And you want to make sure you have good leadership, players, and also you're very communicative with the players. That's one thing I can always say about Adam Silver. He is known as a players commissioner. He was very active. He was very communicative with the players. He was talking to the players consistently throughout Corona to see how we feeling, what's the update, what do we want, what's the next step, and then communicating it with everybody else within the league because they understood, hey, we're all trying to get to a solution about how we want to do this. So let's all come together. Let's all sit down together and see what we want to do here. And so, obviously, that's a big deal. And that's going to be something to look forward to, I think, moving on into the future. But that's my view on how I feel the NBA has been shining during this time period. And coming up next, we're just going to get into some basketball talk. All that right here and more on the podcast.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed how the league has been a shining example for other leagues. And how, again, I'm proud of how the NBA has handled this situation, from its players to commissioner to everyone within the league. Obviously the NBA tries to do anything they can to make a difference. They try to do anything they can to help out in the community and to create a more positive environment for fans and just anybody who supports the league, and also participating in movements around the country to also show that they care about the racial injustice that's been happening in this country, and just anything. And also help how they handle the coronavirus, safety for the players being first priority, but also still trying to give the players what they want and the fans what they want, which is a finish to the season and everything as such. And even within that, I want to use this segment to go even a deeper appreciation for Adam Silver. When he took it for David Stern, a lot of people wondered what kind of commissioner would he be? Taking over David Stern, who helped put the league where they were at that time when he handed over the reins. Obviously, he did a lot for the league and helped them be better than it's ever been in its tenure. And so obviously he had big shoes to fill when he took over as commissioner for David Stern. And so clearly when that happened, one thing he definitely established, which I think as any good boss, in my opinion, you should want, is you need to establish a good relationship with your employees. Show your employees that you care, and I think Adam Silver did that. he communicated with the players and said, listen, I want you guys to be the face of this league. I don't want to be the face of the league. I don't want the office to be the face of the league. I want y'all to be the face of the league. LeBron, you're one of our biggest stars, if not our biggest star. I want you to be one of the leaders of the league. Even though we know Chris Paul is I believe, head of the NBA PA. We also know LeBron's one of the biggest just names in the NBA that also has a big say in what happens. And he allows input from stars and all types of other players on matters that happen around the league, because he knows, listen, the money we get, the revenue we get, everything that we have gotten is because of these players. Without them, we wouldn't have this. We wouldn't be where we are at this moment. We wouldn't be in this position right now. We wouldn't be. We would be potentially struggling. He took the marketing of the NBA and said, we're going to put it around you guys. Now, obviously, yeah, you could sit here and say owners weren't the biggest fans. Maybe at first, because obviously David Stern was more for owners batting for them. So obviously he had to make way with them. But what he used is, listen, if we market the league around players, the league will make more money, which means you can make more money. If you really think about it, have you heard any really negative coaches, owners, or players really talk about Adam Silver in a horrible way? Like, realistically? Not just the casual comment in Bleacher Report or ESPN. And so, if you could tell and look at it and think to yourself, why put yourself in that position? Like, really, why put yourself in that position? As Adam Silver, to take that type of chance. I mean, remember, one of the defining things that will define his tenure was early in his tenure with David Sterling. Those racist comments that he made. Which is, I think, one of the big defining moments that made the players and people around the league trust him when it came to situations like that, radical and racial moments. Because everyone was calling for his head. Players were almost going to boycott because they do not want to play for him. Coaches, other owners didn't like him. And he made that move swiftly. He made him sell that team. He said, you are out. We are not doing this. We are not going to risk the integrity of the league. We're not going to risk loss of money. We're not going to risk protests here. We're not going to risk all of this for you. Because there's a bigger image and there's a bigger vision here that is to be achieved. And I can't allow you to ruin that vision and ruin that definition, or ruin that image I have of this league because of the actions that you decided to take. And he got him out of there. And ever since then, even with the Trayvon Martin, Alton Sterling, Castro, Bryce, all of them, he has always made a statement. He's always talked about it. He's always empowered the players to say, if there is a cause, donate, support, invest in the cause. Don't be afraid. As a league, we got your back. That's why, you have some fans who complain the NBA's too political. There's too many people who they talk about so much stuff that's not basketball related. We don't watch the NBA to hear about politics. We watch the NBA to watch basketball. I'll never forget that famous line. I can't remember who said it to LeBron, I think on Twitter, where they basically told him to shut up and dribble. They basically tried to sit here and say, listen, I view you no more than a basketball player. Anything else, you need to stay away from. And honestly, you see it now more on all the sports websites. When you see the sporting world put more reactions and more stuff into it. Because like I said earlier in the show, it's becoming too big in the world to just not bring it into sports. Like, it's just too big not to bring it into it. You have to bring it into your shows in some capacity. And if you're a fan and you're turned off by it, well, oh well. Because that's how it is. That's how it is. And trying to run away from it isn't going to help your cause. It's not going to help you at all. It makes you look bad. And so, really, Adam Silver's just done a great job to me, with how he's handled every situation, how he's empowered the players, how he's supported the players. I really do hope when the CBA is up, which I believe it will be up, obviously, because every CBA is for every decade. Negotiations, I hope, go well, because he'll really have another part where it's like, okay, I talked to you guys. I want it to work for us. Everybody here, let's make this happen. I think that's going to be the biggest thing moving forward for Adam Silver. And I just want to say, great job, and I'm glad you're commissioner of the NBA, because you've done a great job for everybody here in the league and all the things that you've made and have happened through everything that has happened in the world today. But that's all we have for you right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to listen to our other amazing podcasts here on the GSMC Podcast Network. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review. We always appreciate that. Don't forget to follow us on social media. And y'all stay safe out there and have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.